Okay, it's 11:15, so let's get started. Welcome to our Integrated Pest Management Academic Seminar Series, which is designed to increase awareness of new research and techniques that advance IPM and its adoption in all types of pest management settings. These seminars are roughly once a month during the academic year, and you can find the upcoming seminars as well as our other events like our What's Bugging You First Friday series on our website, which I'll link to in the chat in a minute. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ann Johnson, who's a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Entomology at Penn State. She studies how species native to North America interact with spotted lanternflies and how this could be applied to control their populations. In particular, she researches predators of spotted lanternfly found in the United States and how feeding on milkweed affects spotted lanternfly. So thank you, Anne. Oh, you're muted, Anne.
Okay, better. Hard to see controls when
Mhm.
you are screen sharing. Okay, there we go. So, come on. There it goes. Hello, everyone. I am Anne. I am a postdoctoral researcher here at Penn State University, and I work on basically non-chemical control methods for spotted lanternfly. And today I'll be talking to you about some of my research on specifically how some of our native species here in the United States might help us control them. So, brief introduction to spotted lanternfly for those who have not yet heard of it, though I know it has definitely reached New York, which you can see up here, and I actually grabbed this map from the New York IPM program, so, you guys hopefully are aware of it. It's an invasive plant hopper that was first found in the US in Berks County, Pennsylvania, back in 2014. Since that time, it has spread very widely. It's now found in 20 states, and it feeds on a lot of different kinds of plants. It actually feeds on more than 100 different kinds of plants, though it does have a preference for a plant called tree of heaven, which is another invasive that it actually co-evolved with and is able to take up and store these bitter tasting toxins from, which might be able to deter some predators, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. Here in Pennsylvania, we actually had one vineyard back in 2023 who reported to Claudia Schmidt that in their 20-year-old vines, they actually had a net loss of per acre of about $8,600 per year just in extra treatment costs to manage spotted lanternfly and things like that. But on their 6-year-old vines, which were even younger, they actually had a net loss per acre of uh, more than $30,000 annually, just because in addition to all of the treatment costs, the younger vines weren't resilient enough to survive the spotted lanternfly feeding, so they got stressed out and then ended up dying over the winter. So this is a very serious problem on Pennsylvania grape and potentially could be elsewhere as well. You guys probably know quite a bit about integrated pest management since you're showing up to an IPM seminar, but just as a refresher, it's a concept that originated in the 1960s and 70s where you want to integrate multiple control strategies. So we're not just going to spray pesticides over everything, we're going to try and use several different methods to try and control our pests. This has ecological and economic benefits. Not only are you not getting as much loss of some of your non-target species, which spraying oftentimes can hurt, it also means that if you're not spraying as much, you probably are going to save some money because chemical treatments can be quite expensive. It has a big focus on prevention. If you never have the pest at all, again, you're going to save a lot of that money, get those better yields. So it's good for that. My research in particular that I'm going to be talking to you about today mostly fits into the cultural control category and the biological control category. So I'm going to start out with biological control methods that I've sort of been researching. So biological control is the use of predators, pathogens, or parasitoids, so basically other organisms, to control your pests. There's three kinds. There's classical, where if you have an invasive species, you return to the native range of that species and look for organisms that are controlling them there, and then see if you can bring them over here safely. There's augmentation, where you actually add populations of these controlling organisms to their existing populations. So these are ones that are already here. And then there's conservation biological control, where you actually improve the environment to hopefully attract in more of the predators, natural enemies, whoever is going to be controlling your pest. So my research is focusing primarily on native predators. We have over here a Carolina mantis eating a spotted lanternfly, and since they're native predators, it would be either augmentation or more likely conservation biological control that we can apply this to. Though other people are actually studying pathogens and parasitoids, including Bavaria bassiana, which is a fungal pathogen that is here, and you can encourage, they like wet conditions. And then at the USDA, they're actually looking mostly at a little species of parasitoid wasp called Dryanis, and that would be an example of classical biocontrol. So they went to Southeast Asia, they found this wasp that was using spotted lanternflies to raise its babies, and now they're keeping it in quarantine just to make sure that we're not hurting any of our native plant hoppers, and testing to make sure that it will only feed on spotted lanternfly to potentially release here in the US. So before I started my work on the native predators of spotted lanternfly, we actually didn't know all that much. There was a report by Behringer and Smyers in 2016 that we had a wheel bug, which is pictured here, feeding on spotted lanternfly, as well as a species of predatory stink bug. But the evidence of other predators was pretty much just anecdotal. A lot of people were saying their chickens would eat them. People were kind of, looking around, noticing things eating them, but not really any good deep look into what was feeding on them here. So that was my first step. I wanted to find out what is actually feeding on them here in North America. So I created a Facebook page back in 2020, which was shared by several different organizations, Penn State Extension, our Master Gardener groups, bird watching groups, several different newspapers. So it got pretty widely shared, and then we got nearly 1,300 unique reports as of December 1st, 2022, when we finally cut off the project, 526 of which included pictures and video. So from that project, we learned that the most common type of predator that was feeding on spotted lanternfly that people were seeing were arthropods. So these are our insects, these are things like spiders. So anything with that exoskeleton, the small little guys, are going to be feeding on spotted lanternfly. After that were our birds, coming in with just under half, and then coming in a very distant third with only 60 reports were mammalian predators. Taking a closer look at our arthropod predators, the majority of them, well, not the majority, but the largest group of them were spiders in the order Araneae, followed by praying mantises in the order Mantidea, and then coming in third were our hymenopterans, which in this case were wasps and ants. So all of those were feeding on our spotted lanternflies. On the bird side, we had the chicken family came in first, Phasianidae. This also included some reports of turkeys and some reports of peafowl. It is worth noting when I say this may not necessarily mean that the chicken family is like the greatest bird predator of spotted lanternfly out there. Since we were asking people to report in, and a lot of people interact with chickens on a regular basis, it could just be that more people happened to see the chickens eating them, whereas they may not be out in like the deep woods where all the birds, the wild birds, were feeding on them. After the chicken family, we had the cardinal family. So mostly the northern cardinals, which are pictured here, but we also had scarlet tanagers and rose-breasted grosbeaks reported feeding on these guys. And then coming in third was Mimiidae, which is, in our case, it was all catbirds that were reported feeding on these guys, but enough of them fed on them to actually put this family in third place. I have a lot of other cool things that I learned from this project, but as I am a little bit short on time today, I have just put up the snapshot of the paper title here, as well as a QR code that will actually link you to that article. So if anyone wants to grab a picture of that to maybe follow to it later, you can read all about it and some of the other cool things that I learned about the native predators of spotted lanternfly in North America. Okay, moving on. Once we figured out that arthropods were the most common predators, we decided to see how that interaction with Tree of Heaven, which I mentioned earlier, were affecting them as predators. So we raised a whole bunch of spotted lanternflies. Some of them had access to that Tree of Heaven, half of them did not. And then we did 10 different predator species in choice tests where they were able to choose between a lanternfly that was raised with access to Tree of Heaven and one that was not, and in no choice tests where they only had 9 species of predator and they were only allowed to eat either a spotted lanternfly that was raised with access to Tree of Heaven or a spotted lanternfly that was raised without access to Tree of Heaven. Ants were a little bit different because they needed to be in colony to hunt. So they actually just only did the choice with them, and instead of having a choice between one of each, they had a choice between 10 of each, and we compared the proportions there. We checked for predation at 24 hours, 48 hours, and 1 week, and then looked for statistical significance using Fisher's exact tests. We looked for significance. We actually did not find any. We tested 2 species of ladybugs and 2 species of lacewings. They did not eat any of the provided spotted lanternfly, but all the other predators we tested happily ate whatever lanternflies we provided to them, equally, regardless of treatment, and including in the choice tests, they happily ate both of them. Many of them would go on to eat the one that had not fed on Tree of Heaven after eating one that had fed on Tree of Heaven. They just didn't seem to care. They really liked feeding on spotted lanternfly. Didn't matter whether they were defended or not. This gave us the idea that arthropods are probably the ones who we're going to have the best luck using for biological control. So just to see how some of our commercially available or easily collectible arthropod predators would do, we set up a whole bunch of enclosures with a great plant and a Tree of Heaven plant in them. And then for the nymphal stages, we put 25 nymphs in there. And then for the adults, we put 10 adults in there. We put basically all these different predators as well as a control treatment with no predators, monitored the spotted lanternfly populations in there for a week, and then compared them using a repeated measures ANOVA, followed by a Tukey HSD post hoc test. So for our first instar nymphs, which are the freshly hatched little black ones, we found that both spine soldier bugs and Chinese praying mantises actually reduced our populations relative to the control. Our ladybugs and lacewings, again, did pretty poorly. Some of them actually had higher populations in their enclosures than we had in our control, which had no predators at all. So at this point, we can probably eliminate them as a potential biological control for spotted lanternfly. But definitely these spine soldier bugs, which are a native predatory stink bug, and the praying mantises were doing well. This remained consistent for a lot of our other, our second instars, our third instars, and our adults. So those are the other 2 small black stages of the nymphs, and then the adults are the ones with the wings. So we had the spine soldier bugs, again, doing very well with this purple dashed line. And then our Chinese and our Carolina mantises both reduced those populations significantly relative to our control for all of these life stages. And then, oh no, there we go. Then for our fourth instars, this one, it was actually even the wheel bugs, which we tested, significantly reduced those populations relative to the control. So a lot of our arthropod predators were actually showing promise, which is really cool because, again, these were species that are commercially available, or you can like sort of go out, so they would have some potential for augmentation biological control. In particular, spine soldier bug reduced the populations the most in every single run of this experiment. These are actually spine soldier bug nymphs over here, which, as you can see, they're really cool because they'll work communally to bring down larger prey so that they can all feed together. So this shows good promise as a biological control, especially since these guys actually have what's called an aggregation pheromone. So if you release them in an area, you can have the pheromone there and they're attracted to it, so they'll actually stay in the area. Before we release them, we do want to check a few things. We want to make sure that they're not overly feeding on alternative prey. So if there's like other things in the field that we don't want them to feed on, hopefully they'll still feed on spotted lanternflies, so I'm testing that now. And it's actually looking pretty good. They seem to like feeding on lanternflies. And we were curious if they would show any responses where they either eat more of the lanternflies as they become more available, or if maybe some of their populations go up to sort of meet those lanternfly populations. So we're still testing that. And it would also be really cool to test this in the field a few places before we actually like release it and tell everyone that it's a great idea. So we're working on that as well. This work is also published into a paper. So if you want more details, this QR code leads to that paper, as well as the title here. If you just want to Google the title instead, it should pop right up. And then actually all the papers that I'm talking about today are open access, which means anyone can read them. So they should be good. Okay. Hopefully everyone who got a picture, who wanted a picture, got one. And moving on. So I mentioned that other group that fed a lot on spotted lanternfly were birds. We already knew that birds were affected by the defenses that spotted lanternfly pick up from Tree of Heaven back in Southeast Asia, including a paper from 2011 and then another paper in 2018. In the 2018 paper, they actually saw a change in how the birds reacted over the life cycle of the spotted lanternfly, where they seemed to not have as strong of a preference for the nymphs as they did in the adults, which kind of made sense because the adults would be feeding on that Tree of Heaven longer and probably be picking up more defenses. But we decided to test and see if our North American species would do the same. So for the nymphal stages of the spotted lanternfly, we used this nest box method where we had about 100 different nest boxes set up around Penn State campus. And we had these little feeding cups on top into which we put 10 mealworms, which were alive and wriggling around to attract the birds' attention, and then 10 frozen spotted lanternflies that had either been reared with access to that Tree of Heaven or without. And we did this for all of the different nymphal stages, so first through fourth instars. We then took binoculars and trail cameras for some of the boxes and checked to see what the birds actually did with the spotted lanternfly. We wanted to make sure that they were eating them or feeding them to their chicks and not just like tossing them away. And then after 24 hours, we went back and we counted how many spotted lanternfly were missing and compared it between the ones that were reared with access to Tree of Heaven and the ones that were not. With the result that the birds, actually at all of our different nymphal life stages, preferred the ones that had been reared without access to Tree of Heaven. So even at these nymphal life stages, the birds were actually definitely showing a preference in our tests for the ones that had not fed on Tree of Heaven. Unfortunately, birds stopped nesting before, or at least the birds we were using, stopped nesting before spotted lanternfly turned into adults. So we needed a bit of different methods for the adults. So what we did was we took a whole bunch of them, again, reared with access to Tree of Heaven or without, ground them up, and then incorporated them into these suet cakes and put them into these double-sided feeders at a few locations in central Pennsylvania. We had our trail cameras capture videos of the visiting birds, and then went back and reviewed all that footage to count the number of times that they pecked either one of those suet cakes. With the results that there actually was a significant preference for the suet made with spotted lanternfly that had not fed on Tree of Heaven. It's a bit hard to see in this graph because you'll notice we have a whole bunch of points up here. And that is actually because woodpeckers were pecking suet regardless of what it was so many more times than the songbirds were. So the songbirds were all down here and the woodpeckers were doing like 100+ pecks. So we ended up dividing those out further into the different species of birds that we had visiting our feeder. These are some of the small bird species we had, and when you looked at the species individually, both the chickadees and the white-breasted nuthatches showed a significant preference for that suet that was made with spotted lanternfly that had not fed on Tree of Heaven. And the other ones, while they pecked the suet made without it more often, were not actually significant. But it was still a pretty good indication that they liked the one that didn't have defenses in it. Similar for the woodpeckers, our downy woodpeckers and our red-bellied woodpeckers both showed a significant preference for the suet that was made with spotted lanternflies that had not fed on Tree of Heaven. Hairy woodpeckers again pecked the suet that had those lanternflies in it more often, but not significantly so. So what are our conclusions? Birds in North America, just like the ones in Asia, are indeed affected by the sequestered defenses throughout the spotted lanternfly life cycle. This was different from what the people had seen with the birds they tested where they didn't show that preference for some of that third instar nymphal stage. But again, we're using different species. We're using ones that we actually reared in enclosures, so we knew for certain that they had never fed on Tree of Heaven, whereas if you go back and read that paper, they just collected theirs in the field in an area where there wasn't Tree of Heaven around. But these guys actually tend to move quite a bit, so it's possible those spotted lanternfly fed on Tree of Heaven before they grabbed them. And there's also a possibility that since our birds were nesting, they might have been a bit more sensitive. We actually did break down some of this data where we compared the number of the spotted lanternfly that the adult bird ate itself versus the ones that they fed to their chicks. And while we didn't find any significant differences, it is very interesting to note that they would only feed their chicks the ones that had been reared without access to Tree of Heaven. The ones that they ate themselves were going to be the ones that had been fed on Tree of Heaven. What this could mean is that if we want to go back and do that conservation biological control with birds, removing Tree of Heaven is a good first step because that's going to get rid of those defenses spotted lanternflies have against the birds and maybe encourage them to eat some more. This is also published in a paper, so if again, you want to snap a pic of this QR code and go check that out later, or grab this title and just Google it. That would be very cool. So there's definitely more in here than I had time to talk about. Because I also have some really cool cultural control research that I wanted to share with you guys. So cultural control is when you make the local environment less suitable for pests. Oftentimes this is things like providing your plants with proper irrigation, making sure you're not overwatering them or underwatering them, making sure that they're in the correct type of soil, getting good fertilizer, basically anything you can do to reduce those plant stresses, make them oftentimes better able to handle an infestation by a pest. It also can be creating habitat for beneficial organisms, kind of that conservation biological control meets up with the cultural biological control really well. And it can be things like rotating your crops so that you're not getting the same pests over and over, that they just don't have those hosts there anymore, or planting crops that are resistant to being fed on by these pests. Sometimes those resistant crops can actually be plants that kill the pest. Most people are familiar, well, not most people, but some people are familiar with BT plants, which are genetically engineered to have these proteins from a bacteria in them that can actually kill specifically like corn caterpillar pests is usually what I see this in. But we had perhaps the idea, and it was kind of floating around online for a while, that a plant that might kill spotted lanternfly is milkweed. So milkweed are actually a couple of different species. They're found in the Asclepius genus, and they are native to Africa and North and South America, so they didn't really co-evolve with spotted lanternfly, which is out in Southeast Asia. And milkweeds are interesting because they produce latex and toxins and all sorts of things to defend against herbivores that might want to feed on them. People really hadn't done all that much with milkweed before I kind of picked it up. Heather Leach, who was at Penn State for a while, tested milkweed as a host plant just to see. This was part of a larger project where we were basically seeing, hey, if we feed spotted lanternfly on just this plant, can that keep them alive? And then she only did a 36-hour check, but the spotted lanternflies died when fed on milkweed alone within 36 hours. And we had in that community science project with my predators, a lot of people reporting in that they were seeing lanternflies feeding on their milkweed and then finding them dead near the base of the plants. At the time, Penn State's official position was basically, we have no scientific evidence, which I think a lot of people in the department kind of took as, well, it probably doesn't work then, but it doesn't mean that. It actually means we don't know. So me and a friend who was working on monarchs at the time decided to test it with just common milkweed. And we actually found that after only 24 hours, we were getting like 60 to 80% mortality in our spotted lanternfly that were fed on milkweed alone, relative to, like maybe 20% mortality in the ones that we fed on grape to compare them to, and we actually had no mortality on grape in our adults. So that was really interesting. So we're like, okay, so feeding on milkweed probably does kill spotted lanternflies, but surely they won't feed on milkweed in the presence of a preferred host like grape. So we did choice tests where we had a milkweed plant and a grape plant in there, and they actually showed no significant preference between milkweed and grape at any of our hourly checks in any life stage except for the adults, which you can see on this graph here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. They showed a preference in our last 3 checks for adults, but also a whole bunch of them were dying, which, again, we saw no mortality on grape alone, so it was potentially the case that they were feeding on milkweed when we weren't watching. So once we learned that, we kind of wanted to get into the potential mechanisms behind why. So that's what I did this year. We set up different treatments. We set up grape alone, again, no choice in choice, but grape, again, starvation this time, because usually that latex works by sort of gumming up the mouth parts. So if they weren't starving to death, then we know it wasn't just like the latex gumming them up. It would actually be a toxin in the milkweed. And then 3 different species of milkweed are common milkweed, which has kind of like a medium level of these toxins called cardenolides. They're the same ones that monarchs take up and store. Swamp milkweed, A. incarnata, which has a pretty high level of cardenolides, and then butterfly milkweed, which actually has a very low level of cardenolides, just to see if we would have different levels of survival in our different levels of cardenolides, because that would maybe indicate that the cardenolides were the thing killing the lanternflies. So we did no choice and choice tests with these 3 species. And then for the adult stages this year, we actually marked them with this fluorescent powder and photographed them once per minute with infrared cameras, just to try and catch if they were feeding on the milkweed when we weren't watching at our checks. So for our first instar 24-hour mortality, we're seeing good mortality in our no choice tests on our different milkweed species. We saw still some mortality in the choice tests, and this kind of made sense to us. Yeah, Incarnata is the one that had the high cardenolide level, but you know, we weren't getting that much mortality in the starvation, so maybe there was some difference in how much they were feeding. Tuberosa was fairly low, but then second instars hit, and suddenly tuberosa was our highest mortality. So they are still dying after feeding on tuberosa, which has a very low level of cardenolides, which was incredibly interesting, because that kind of started ruling out cardenolides as well as being a driving factor in the mortality. And we kind of knew it wasn't the latex gumming things up because we weren't seeing nearly as high mortality in our starvation. A similar story with our third instars, Syriaca again doing really well. The common milkweed is Syriaca. And again, not really getting mortality in our grape and starvation treatments. Fourth instars, again, same deal. And then finally in adults, same idea. We did actually finally get some mortality in our grape, but it was definitely higher in the milkweed. In our choice tests, we did this year have them show a significant preference for grape in 47 out of the 72 checks we did. And then their ones with no significant difference are displayed in this table to the left. Again, you can see, because I color-coded these by species, it's all over for the species, all over for the life stages. But again, we're still getting mortality in those choice checks, which I showed you earlier. So are they feeding when we're not checking? Yes, they are. We haven't gone through all the camera data, but this one here, you can clearly see this lanternfly feeding on this is swamp milkweed, when in between when we were doing checks. So we're still going back through the camera data, but yes, they are feeding on milkweed when we didn't watch. So our conclusions, feeding on milkweed definitely seems to be killing our spotted lanternfly. This one is actually in the process of dying, hanging onto the milkweed as it's kind of like falling back. They don't really seem to avoid feeding on the milkweed, and we still are looking into potential mechanisms as to what's actually killing them. It would also be interesting to see if they can recover after feeding on milkweed, and if they have maybe more of a preference. If we put in like Tree of Heaven in there, would they stay off of the milkweed more? We are also set up next summer to do some field tests where we plant milkweed in vineyards to see if that does anything for our populations there. So my overall conclusions is that we actually do have some alternatives to chemical controls available for integrated pest management programs that need to target spotted lanternfly. Cultural control, we're still building a case for, but at this point I would say that biological control is pretty well underway. And I would say that personally, I learned that communication with the public is really important. We first started looking into the milkweed thing because I was just getting repeatedly asked about it by people, not necessarily because people thought it would work. And we were able to learn so much about spotted lanternfly predators just from the observations that were submitted from the general public. I might have time for questions. I don't actually know how fast I went. I think I went pretty fast. But my email's there too, and then my funding sources are at the bottom there, if anyone wants to chat.
Great. Thank you, Anne. That was fantastic. Unbelievable amount of work you've done. And it's also so cool.
Yeah.
Really neat. So yeah, so if folks have questions or comments, feel free to either unmute or to type them into the chat box. Either works. And I see that we have one question already from Brad. Can one-spined soldier beetle adult kill one adult SLF, one-to-one
Yes.
like that?
Yeah, so one definitely can. Hang on. I'll go back to my question slide. It doesn't even actually need to be an adult spine soldier bug to kill them. So I should have left this up because that was a great picture. I think. Okay. Let me share again. Dude. Okay. So this is actually a nymph taking down a, well, fourth instar, but still a much larger spine soldier bug. Spotted lanternfly. It's a spine soldier bug up top, all on its own. So yes, a single one can take it down. It takes more time for them to kill them because so these guys have these sort of needle-like mouth parts called a stylet that they stab into them, and then they kind of just like slowly drain the life out of them. So when they're all working together, they'll bring it down faster, but one can take one. And I actually used spine soldier bugs in my choice tests, and they were alone in those, and they were doing just fine taking them down in the choice tests. Yeah.
Okay.
More things
And
here.
then, yeah, Kathy mentions we witnessed yellow jackets attacking adult spotted lanternfly. Is this consistent with other reports that you've had?
This is definitely consistent. So yellow jackets did actually make up the bulk of the wasps that we had reported when I mentioned that those hymenopterans were made up of wasps and ants. A lot of them were yellow jackets. So yeah, yellow jackets definitely seem to go after spotted lanternflies.
Okay. Marcus asks, do you have any idea of amphibians or reptiles' ability to feed on spotted lanternfly without getting sick? Do you think it would be a safe insect to feed pet toads?
Yeah. So I would say we had a few reports of them feeding on them. The one case of reported predator death that we did get in that community science project, which hopefully you snapped a pic of that QR code you can read about, was a frog. But it was a frog that the person said they had seen feeding on spotted lanternfly like throughout the whole summer, and then one day they went down to their pond and they found it dead without a mark on it. So there are actually a lot of things that can kill a frog that are not necessarily repeatedly eating spotted lanternfly. And also, they did not say they did anything to make sure it was even the same frog they had been seeing. So take that with, you know, a good shaker full of salt. But yeah, I probably wouldn't intentionally, I wouldn't choose to feed spotted lanternfly to any of my pets. Um, but yeah, there's at least like, in theory, usually when things take up and sequester toxins, the goal is not usually to like kill a predator. It's usually more to make them sick so that they can like learn from the experience, because if it's just a one-to-one kill that way, nobody learns anything, and basically your babies aren't protected or anything.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I probably would not intentionally feed ones to my pets unless it was something like I had just reared this with no access to Tree of Heaven. Then I might trust it a bit more, but I would not intentionally feed it to a pet toad.
Okay, thank you. Gareth asks, do you have any information on the verticillium fungus that kills Tree of Heaven? It's apparently it's spreading in Pennsylvania, but it is available as or wondering if it's available as a commercial pesticide.
Yeah, I don't have any good info on that. I don't believe it's available as a commercial pesticide just because usually verticillium is more of like uh it's a issue in maples, silver maple in particular. So I don't think most people really considered it as a control until they started noticing it was in Tree of Heaven as well. And it takes quite a while for things to become available as a commercial pesticide. So my instinct would be that it is not yet commercially available. But that is also not my area of research, so I don't know if anyone's tried.
Mm-hmm.
But my instinct would be probably not yet, if
Mm-hmm.
ever.
Okay. And thank you to Addison for putting some of those links in the chat. And yeah, and Brian mentioned we'll also hopefully post this on our YouTube channel, this recording of the seminar in a few weeks, if folks want to grab the QR codes that Anne shared at that time. And then Nancy asks, are spotted lanternflies attracted to milkweed over other plants typically found in home gardens, especially native gardens?
I would say we don't have any evidence that they're attracted to milkweed. They just don't really show. So, like, they're just like not really like showing a significant like deterrence to it. Um, I would say from what I've seen, lanternflies eating in like out in the wild, they kind of just like if there's not like one of their favorite things there, oftentimes they'll just sort of hit the first like plant or honestly vertical object and they'll like try and feed on it, and if they get sap coming out, then they kind of stay. So I've like seen them try to feed on telephone poles. We did a study where we were trying to monitor their movement, like how fast they could move through a forest. And while some of them did make it like it out to like 60 meters in a week, the majority hit the first tree that was uphill from the release point and just stayed there. Um, so I would say that if there's a lot of milkweed in their garden, that increases the chance that they'll hit that instead of another plant. But there's nothing particularly attractive about it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Such good answers, Anne.
Thanks.
Um, and then Mary asks that she just read an article about bats eating spotted lanternfly, and was wondering, yeah, is that significant? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, we definitely had reports coming in of bats feeding on spotted lanternfly. Um, I think this really depends on the type of bat. A lot of lanternflies are not going to be flying super late into the night. So if it's a bat that relies on sort of aerial hunting to catch its prey, there may be less chance of interaction, but we had reports and pictures of them feeding on them. Um, I will say that if you go and read the one where I talk a lot about the bird predators for those suet feeders, we also did have some mammalian visitors, and the mammals really really preferred to feed on the suet made with spotted lanternfly that had not fed on Tree of Heaven, even more so than the birds. Um, my guess being that they probably had more smell at play because, like, I could actually smell the difference between the ones that were defended or not. So I gotta imagine that a lot of other mammals can as well. So the mammals are probably more sensitive to whether or not they're defended, but again, if you get rid of that Tree of Heaven, you might encourage more bats to eat any of the evening flying lanternflies that you have. So, yeah, I think what's good for bats is good for all the other potential predators as well.
Okay, great. Emily mentioned, I think this is more of a comment, that it sounds like her dog seems to enjoy eating spotted lanternfly to her chagrin. Um, and then Matt asks, what else is known about the cardinalide milkweed, secondary metabolites and defense? Any candidates for the spotted lanternfly mortality effect?
Yeah, so the one we're trying right now is a group of compounds called pregnane glycosides. which are another good group of um, toxins that are found in milkweed. The issue I have been running into is since it was discovered that cardenolides were the toxins that milkweed produces that monarchs are sequestering, taking up and storing, a lot of people kind of just stopped researching all the other ones. So I'm doing a lot of digging back into very old papers, trying to see what else might be in milkweed to test. Um, it could also just be a combination of all the different toxins. So, like, maybe cardenolides will kill them, but butterfly milkweed might have cardenolides, impregnating glycosides, and alkaloids that all work together to also kill them. So that will take certainly a while to sort out, and probably help from some really good chemists. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Then we've got some discussion, which is great. And then Brian asks, is there documentation of predation, or let's see, it's blocked, predatory insects building up after spotted lanternfly moves into a new area? And it sounds like maybe work with Matt, who posted a link to what y'all just published on the survey of honeydew feeders.
um,
So.
yeah, I actually should read that one. That's not from my group. We did have people telling us about a buildup of praying mantises in particular through that community science project. But uh, I have not I have not yet done a good survey of like the predators in the field to actually like know that. Um, we with spine soldier bug in particular, um, on my slide where I had functional and numerical response. Functional response is when a predator eats more of a prey item if that prey item's population is higher. A numerical response is when they have more babies, so that the babies then eat more of that pest as they become more available. So we started with functional response this year. There are intentions to maybe test numerical responses in the future. So we might have evidence on that in a couple years. But yeah, I think the really cool. I want to read this paper. This looks cool. I'm clicking the link.
Yep. Great. Okay, let's do two final questions here. Where you've been doing great here. So fantastic. There's a lot of interest in this. Marcus asks, has anyone found that areas with pre-existing high populations of Ailanthus webworm tend to reduce potential populations of spotted lanternfly?
I don't know of anyone who's reported this. Um, I would say that I have seen lanternflies still feeding on Tree of Heaven that has been defoliated by Ailanthus webworm, um, which because they're sap feeders, so they don't need the leaves to be there to still feed on the plant. But where they might be helpful in working together is if the pair combined stress out the Tree of Heaven enough, especially if it's like a young or like otherwise stressed by other factors, Tree of Heaven, then the tree itself might die. But I don't think it doesn't, I've not seen that it reduces the number of spotted lanternflies necessarily on the tree or their populations.
Okay, interesting. And then Kathy has a question, and of course, kind of a side note, we can't legally recommend home remedies that aren't kind of registered as labeled pesticides, at least in New York. But she's asking about Dawn dish detergent, and maybe you could speak on kind of soaps in general and how that might interact with their exoskeleton and
Yeah,
impact their survival.
yeah. We can also not recommend home brewed weird things here in Pennsylvania. Um, and also, I will say that dish detergent in particular can actually sometimes lead to like burning on your plants if your plants are sensitive.
Mm.
So I will warn you of that too before you just like, oh, they can't recommend stuff for legal reasons. Um, yeah, you also might hurt your plants. So I do think that needs to be clear. There are soaps and oils that are available um, that have been shown to be effective against spotted lanternfly, which, as Brian kind of mentioned, oftentimes, so the soaps kind of work by like a lot of insects have sort of a waxy covering on their exoskeleton to keep water in, and those soaps will remove that, and then they just kind of dry out and die. And then there is the oils are more like usually plug up their they breathe through kind of holes on the side of their body called spiracles. Those oils can plug those up. And the oils also work on the egg masses people have been finding because they also have holes and pores on the egg masses to kind of you can block. Penn State Extension has a spotted lanternfly management guide that has a whole bunch of the chemical treatments that they have tested. I can find that really quick.
Okay.
And
Well,
I will
as you're doing
drop a
that,
link in the chat.
okay. Let's thank Anne, and we'll formally close the I guess the formal part of the seminar here. But we have another 10 minutes with Anne. If people want to just come up and say hi informally, make sure to thank Anne in the comments, as a lot of you have done. I see a lot of also virtual hands clapping. So yeah, this has been fantastic, and yeah, once again, if folks just want to kind of come up and say hi, we're kind of replicating the kind of post seminar time when you can just kind of informally ask a few questions. You're welcome to stay on, but I'm going to stop the recording at this point.